everyone, I am Merve.
And I'm Amber Sheldon.
Today we'd like to discuss what the goal of thought experiments are. Are they supposed to provide us with knowledge? Are they supposed to support arguments, or are they arguments themselves? And one lingering question I always had is that on the one hand, thought experiments seem very counterintuitive, but it seems that they are meant to test our intuitions. So my question is, how come so surreal thought experiments can test our intuitions? And a good example for this is Judith Thomson's thought experiment on violinist case to support, to argue for our rights for abortion. So let's discuss that thought experiment. Could you describe it, and
Yes.
what do you think the goal of that thought experiment is?
Absolutely. So, this is an interesting thought experiment to choose, especially if we want to bring up the problem. Are these experiments too abstract to have really any meaningful way to contribute to a philosophical discussion, especially on a topic on something so applicable and practical like abortion? So the thought experiment goes, you wake up and you've been kidnapped by a group of fanatical violin enthusiasts, and they have attached you to the circulatory system of their favorite violinist, and he has some sort of disease that if you detach from him, he will die. And you have to stay attached to him for the next 9 months to keep him alive. Now, a violinist is a person, and a violinist has a right to life. Should you detach yourself from him? Or would it be wrong for you to detach yourself from him? Do you have the authority, the right, the volition to detach yourself from him and let him die? Or are you obligated to remain his life support system, basically, for the next 9 months, is sort of the question that is brought forth.
Mm-hmm. And do you think that the argument that one's right to life cannot come at the expense of another's right to use their body? Do you think that this argument is already embedded in the example, or?
Yeah, that's a good question. It seems to be embedded in the example, which was the salience of using, making it so ridiculous that it's a violinist, because when we're arguing that if a fetus is a person and it is wrong to kill them because they have a right to life and they are a person, have that status, we are basically giving them the same status as the violinist has in this context, because a violinist is at least something that's more agreed upon as being a person. So even if it is absurd, it does bring into account that salient feature.
And do you think that it is also checking our intuitions? Because at some point, Thomson says that, well, you might really think that it would be very hard for you to unplug yourself from somebody if his life is dependent on you for 9 months. So it seems that she's appealing to our intuitions, although it is important to note that she also says that it would be very nice of you to be plugged into the violinist to save his life, but it doesn't follow that you have a moral obligation to be hooked up to him. So it might be really praiseworthy, but it doesn't imply that it would be blameworthy if you decide not to be tied to somebody for 9 months. So it seems that it's also checking our intuitions. But I think you're also saying that it is checking our worldview in a way.
Yes. I think there's more to a thought experiment than just testing our intuitions, especially because there's so many instances where our intuitions are just wrong about things. Intuition isn't really what I would want to be the most salient grounds that we appeal to when we are thinking of what justifies some sort of moral position. I see a thought experiment, as more of a test case for a worldview. let's say it's testing your commitments, your other commitments. So if you're committed to the idea that the fetus has a right to life and it would be wrong to abort them because they are a person with a right to life, well, okay, well, what if you're attached to this violinist? Do your commitments extend that far? It allows you to reevaluate, am I really committed to this as a principle, and what reasons are driving my commitments? I think it has more argumentative, contentful, reflective value than just targeting an intuition.
Right, that's a good point. But I think we could say that it is doing both because, so for example, whenever I explain this thought experiments to people who are not familiar with thought experiments, one initial reaction I get is that, well, in the violence case is not a good analogy for real life because, like, in real life we know what we are getting into, but it's not like, we are kidnapped by someone out of nowhere. Even if it's accidental, like a pregnancy could be accidental, we still know the risks. And I think in order to respond to that kind of a reaction, Thomson provides another thought experiment to respond to that reaction. So it is not like that. It's not like she thinks that it has nothing to do with intuition. It's not that she's only checking a worldview. I think she's doing that, but maybe she's doing both of them. Yeah, would you like to give that second thought experiment and how it's different from the first one?
Yeah, let's say, someone reflects on the violinist thought experiment and draws out this difference that, like, in real life, when it comes to the matter of, like, sex and reproduction, we know what we're getting into, unless you are the victim of sexual violence or rape. You know what you're getting into, and you consent to perhaps this possibility of becoming pregnant, even if you use birth control. So Thomson has this other example that is the infamous plant people thought experiment, which is a scenario where we live in a world populated by these pollen plant seed people that float around in the air. And if they come into your window, they will land in your upholstery and grow in your house. So let's say one day is hot. You pay good money to live in your home, and you have a right to open the window on a hot day, but you take proper precautions to prevent the plant people from coming in. You put up special screens. Those screens end up being defective, and the plant people start to grow in your house. Are you allowed to remove them? Would it be wrong? Are they allowed to stay? And why?
Yeah. So I think one assumption in that thought experiment is that sex is just such a basic need, just as opening a window. So nobody would or should blame you for opening window, even though you know that there are some risks, right? So that's one assumption. But I want to go back to the initial question I asked, like whether such a counterintuitive and surreal example is a good way to test our intuitions. So one might say that, like, if we were really living in a world where human seeds are sticking to our window, maybe we would have taken different precautions. Like, we would start to take different measures. So this is to show that maybe our intuitions are not well equipped to understand what we would do in that kind of a surreal case. This doesn't mean that we should do away with our intuitions, but it's just a way to think that maybe we are not very good at understanding or predicting what we would do or how we would judge in that kind of a surreal scenario.
Yeah, I think this one is so not good, actually. I do not like the plant people example very much because it is such a surreal scenario and because it seems to like jump off of this assumption that like, and not because I make this counter assumption, but this claim seems to stem from the assumption that it's a basic right to open your window and just have a sex life, have a like diverse when non for reproduction only sex life, whereas that's not really the case. There's like a lot of people who are opposed to abortion who do not even hold that premise. So I'm not even sure who this argument was for either.
Maybe it is like she's trying to motivate people to think that like it is such a natural thing to open your window, and even then yeah, like nobody should blame you for opening the window. But you are right, like people who are opposed to
Let's
abortion,
say Catholics, for example, that's a lot of people who like are opposed to abortion are also largely opposed to birth control as well. And
this actually, I think this brings us to a different issue with thought experiments, especially with this one, because like abortion is so much tied to the oppression of women historically and socially. And some people say that, like, again, like when I explain this example to non-philosophers or or other kinds of philosophers, not analytic philosophers, but like people who don't like analytic philosophy and thought experiments, one reaction they give is that, well, like this is such a morally loaded issue that we cannot really rely on our intuitions to know or to draw conclusions about what to do. Like suppose that we are living in a world where people really say that, well, I would be tied to the violinist. Even that is not, cannot, and shouldn't be the right conclusion to draw on an issue where women's rights are at stake in a very oppressed society.
I see, yeah, because of the larger context in which this issue is embedded, there's a level of seriousness that that could be said to be lost when we apply these absurd scenarios as toy examples.
Right. I really like the way you put it. Like we lose the seriousness of this issue because it sounds that we are not serious for some reason. You know, like this is such a very important issue that like how come that you can rely on a very abstract setup to think about rights of women. Okay, I think it's a good way to wrap it up, and we might come back to these issues and social, political like problems, implications with it, and other kinds of thought experiments, like whether they have arguments embedded in them, just as this one. We could come back to this.
Yeah, overall, I think this was a really good way to just kind of introduce like a more in-depth way to even think about working through a thought experiment, more than just what's on the surface of like the silly trolley problem, the silly weird like brain in a vat. What other things are operating within a thought experiment that make it interesting?
We should definitely get back to trolleys and brain in a vat. I love those thought experiments. Okay, thank you for watching us.
See ya.